At my son's promotion party at the mountain lodge, he walked right up to me, pulled a heavy folder from his coat, and slapped it down on the table. "Sign it," he said, his voice flat and cold. I opened it up and my whole body went numb. It was a complete waiver and release. A document severing every legal and familial tie between us, stripping me of my rights and my place. I looked up into his eyes and asked, "Is this really what you want?" He didn't even hesitate. He pointed straight at the signature line and shouted, loud enough for all 80 guests to hear, "Just sign it. You've been nothing but a parasite your entire life." The entire banquet hall went dead silent. Every head turned and every pair of eyes locked onto us. Before we go any further, thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot to me. Please drop a comment down below and let me know where you're watching from. Your city, your country. I'd love to know who's sharing this space with me today. Also, a quick note. This story contains dramatized elements for narrative flow, and any resemblance in names or places is purely coincidental. But the lesson at the heart of it is very real. The snow started falling around 3 in the morning. I knew that because I had been lying awake since 2:30, listening to that soft, steady tapping against the bedroom window. The kind of quiet ticking that only happens when the flakes are tiny and the air is bitter cold, right before the real storm hits. By the time I pulled on my work pants and laced up my boots in the kitchen, 4 inches of powder were already sitting on the porch steps, coming down thick out of the pitch-black Colorado sky. My name is Cormac Strand. I'm 68 years old. On the morning of November 14th, 2024, I was driving my old 2007 Ford truck through the empty streets of Telluride. A paper cup of lukewarm coffee was sitting in the holder, and a flathead shovel was resting in the bed. The same shovel my father used before it ever belonged to me. Most mornings, I don't think much about where I'm going. I just drive. Coldwater Ridge Lodge sits right at the base of the San Juan Mountains. In the dark before dawn, it looks less like something man-made and more like something that grew right out of the rock and ice. Slow, stubborn, and built to withstand whatever nature throws at it, just like everything else in this part of the state. 400 acres, 42 guest cabins, a 14-room main lodge, 2 restaurants, and a banquet room big enough for 200 people if you push the tables back. My father bought the bare dirt when nobody else wanted it, and I spent my life building what stands there today. When I pulled into the lot, it was completely empty. I cut the engine, put on my gloves, and stepped out. The air hit my chest like a physical weight, cold enough to freeze your lungs if you took too deep a breath. "Morning, Cormac." Frank Odell was already standing by the side door. Frank was always there first. For 22 years, he had shown up before sunrise every single day, and in all that time, I don't think I ever managed to beat him to the property. "Frank," I said. He walked up beside me, carrying his own shovel over his shoulder. He was 55, thick-built, with a face weathered by decades of working outdoors. We headed toward the main entrance without another word. Frank and I had outgrown the need for small talk a long time ago. "Might la cleared seat." We cleared the front walkway first, then the narrow path leading down to the eastern cabins, and finally the drainage line along the north slope to keep it from icing over. There was a rhythm to the work that my hands remembered better than my own mind. Push, lift, throw, step. When I was 12, my dad taught me how to move snow without throwing out your back. "You don't fight the weight," he used to tell me. "You guide it. You use its own momentum against it." I could still hear his voice in the crisp morning air, and I still did it his way. At 6:50, a sleek black SUV pulled into the far end of the lot. Clean body, spotless tires, without a single scratch on the paint. I watched the door open, and watched my son step out wearing a long wool coat, a leather briefcase slung over his shoulder. He walked toward the main doors, with the kind of confident posture that said he owned the place. Derek didn't look in my direction. He hadn't looked in lookin' track. So long that I had stopped keeping track. The new general manager has arrived, Frank said, his tone dry and careful. That's my son, I said. Frank didn't say anything to that. He pushed another shovel full of snow over the timber fence and watched it fall into the drift. Big event tonight, he added after a moment. His official promotion party, I said, turning back to the drain. 80 guests, full catering service. Frank made a quiet noise in the back of his throat. You going? I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick cardstock envelope I had found in my mailbox 2 nights earlier. Ivory paper, gold foil lettering. I turned it over so Frank could read the line typed right under my name. Cormac Strand, maintenance, staff. Frank read it. The muscle in his jaw flexed once. Unbelievable, he muttered. I'll be there, I said, slipping the envelope back into my pocket. Just make sure the banquet hall audio system is fully tested by 5 o'clock. Complete check. And tell whoever's running the board to make sure the recording function is active the entire time. No exceptions. Frank looked at me for a long second, giving me a look he had only used a handful of times in 22 years. It was the look that meant he understood more than I was saying, and he was choosing not to ask the questions I wasn't going to answer anyway. Got it, he said. We finished the north drain and moved on to the cabin loop. The sky above the peaks was turning a pale, icy gray as the sun tried to break through the clouds. The coffee in my truck had gone completely cold, and my shoulders were aching. A dull, familiar ache that comes with working in extreme cold at my age. Something I had long stopped complaining about. I built every single wall standing on that mountain. And tonight, someone was going to try to take it all away. By the time I got home that evening, the invitation had been sitting in my pocket for 16 hours, and I still hadn't fully decided what I was going to do. I hung my heavy coat on the hook by the door and kicked off my boots. Vera was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold in front of her, untouched and forgotten, the way drinks often are when your mind is somewhere else entirely. When I walked in, her eyes went straight to my coat pocket. Women have a way of looking right at the spot where they already know a secret is hiding. They sent you one, she said. It wasn't a question. Maintenance staff, I replied. Vera set her cup down with a soft click and pressed her lips together. She laid her hands flat on the table, completely still. After 39 years of marriage, I knew what that stillness meant. It meant she was weighing 2 or 3 different things she wanted to say and deciding not to say any of them just yet. Sit down, Cormac, she said quietly. I sat. The kitchen was warm, smelling faintly of the pine cleaner she used on the floors, with that deeper underlying scent that every old home carries in the winter. Dry wood, trapped heat, and the quiet memory of 1,000 meals cooked in the same room. I built that house the second year we were married, working weekends around my shifts at the resort, framing it by hand, over 2 long summers. My father helped me pour the foundation. Tell me about August, Vera said. I looked at her. You know about August. I know what you've told me over 39 years, she said gently. But I don't know all of it. Tonight, I want to hear the whole thing, start to finish. Because tomorrow you walk into that banquet hall, and I need to know exactly what we're standing on. Her eyes were steady on mine. Clear, dark brown, unbroken. Those were the same eyes that had looked across a diner booth at me in the spring of 1985. When she was 22 and I was 28, back when neither of us had any idea what the next 4 decades would ask of us. I reached out and covered her hands with mine. "All right," I said. "From the beginning. My father, August Strand, came to Telluride in the winter of 1973. He had $400 in his pocket, an old pickup truck, and no real intention of staying, except that his alternator died on Main Street. And the mechanic in town was the first honest man he'd met across 3 state lines. He rented a small room in a boarding house on Colorado Avenue and took a job clearing snow for the county road crew. He got up at 4:30 every morning and worked until dusk. In the spring of '74, he walked the ridgeland above the valley, a strip of rough, overgrown slope that nobody wanted, because it faced the wrong way for ski runs and was too far off the main road to be convenient. He stood up there for a long time, looking at it. Then he bought it. "How much?" Vera asked softly. $4,200, I said. He borrowed the last $800 from that same mechanic and paid him back in 2 months. I was born 4 years later. I grew up understanding that our family owned that land the same way other families owned their last name. It wasn't something handed to us like a gift. It was something my father looked at when no one else saw value in it, and worked until it became something real. When I was 7, he put a shovel in my hands. When I was 16, he took me up to the ridge on a freezing January morning. The ground was frozen solid under a foot of fresh snow. He swept his arm out across the horizon, the brush, the bare tree line, the jagged peaks, fading into a pale blue sky. "What do you see?" he asked me. I squinted against the glare. "Nothing much." "That's right," he said, nodding slowly, as if I'd said something brilliant instead of something obvious. "Anybody driving past looks up here and sees nothing. That's what keeps us safe. The day this place looks like real wealth to the outside world is the day people start trying to figure out how to take it from you. You understand that?" I didn't understand it then. Not really. "I understand it now," I told Vera. She squeezed my fingers. "Keep going." August passed away in the spring of 2003. He was 71 years old, and he went out the way he always said he would, working. It was a Tuesday morning, and he was out walking the eastern boundary line, checking the drainage runoff after the snowmelt. His heart simply gave out. They found him sitting against a ponderosa pine, his hands resting in his lap, facing the mountains. He left the land, the lodge, which by then had 12 cabins and 40 employees, and the holding company to me. It was a company I had quietly set up 6 years earlier under the name Strand Mountain Holdings. He had handed the legal paperwork to Hollis Wayne, the attorney, who had handled our family affairs since 1991. He left Hollis a letter with very specific instructions regarding the estate procedures, which went through smoothly in 2004 without a single objection, mostly because there was no one else around to object. He left one more thing. He left a sealed envelope for Vera, with her name written across the front in his thick, heavy handwriting. He didn't offer an explanation. He just told me, "Give this to her after I'm gone. She'll know when it's time to open it." "I still have it," Vera said softly. I looked at her. "I never opened it." She continued, her voice dropping half an octave, the way it always did when something weighed heavy on her heart. 21 years, Cormac. It's been sitting right there in the nightstand drawer. Sometimes I take it out and just hold it. I always thought you'd tell the kids first. I thought I'd open it after everything was out in the open. The words settled between us in the quiet kitchen, heavy with the weight of years. I looked down at her hands beneath mine, at the fine lines around her knuckles, at the way her thumb pressed firmly into my palm. I know, I said. Tomorrow's the day, she said quietly. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a demand. It was just an undeniable truth, a realization that we had finally run out of road. Outside the window, the snow began falling again, soft, heavy, and relentless, covering the driveway, the yard, and the distant ridge where my father had stood back in 1974, seeing a future that no one else could see. I sat there in the warmth of the kitchen, holding my wife's hands, thinking about all the things I had never said out loud to my son, and wondering how long a secret can stay buried before it stops being a shield and turns into something else entirely. Vera went up to bed around 11. I stayed at the table with an empty coffee cup, surrounded by that deep, heavy quiet that only settles over a house when everyone else is asleep and you're left alone with the things you've been putting off. I had been putting this off for a very long time. The first time I realized what money could do to a person. Not having it, but discovering it was there, was when I was 32 years old, sitting across a booth from a man named Russell Keene at a local spot on Colorado Avenue. Russell and I had grown up together in Telluride. We went to the same school, played football on the dirt lot behind the hardware store, and made our fair share of bad decisions together in our 20s. He was the kind of friend you trusted without thinking twice, the way you trust a road you've driven 1,000 times. I never had a reason to doubt him. That night, I made the mistake of opening up to him. August had been gone for 3 years. The resort was thriving, expanding, turning into a serious operation. I held the keys to a company worth more than any number we had ever dreamed of, back when we were throwing a football in the dirt. I shared those numbers with him because he was my oldest friend, and I was tired of carrying the weight of it all by myself. Cormac, he said, raising his glass, you're sitting on a gold mine. A month later, Russell walked into my father's old office, which was mine by then, and sat down across the desk with a folded piece of paper in his hand. I want to buy the north parcel, he said bluntly. I found a developer out of Durango who's interested. We split the profit down the middle. I just stared at him. August told me back in the day that he'd think about it, Russell said. My father had been dead for 3 years. He had never said a word like that to anyone. I knew that for a fact. And, just like I knew the drainage patterns on the east slope and the load-bearing weight of the main lodge roof, without having to think twice about it. I took the paper from him, unfolded it, and looked at the price he was offering for a piece of land worth easily 4 times as much. Then I folded it back up and slid it across the table. "Get out of my office, Russell," I said, "and don't come back." The look on his face shifted into something dark. Then he stood up, grabbed the paper, and walked out. I never spoke to him again. I sat in that study for a long time after he left. My chest felt completely hollow, and it had nothing to do with money. It was the bitter realization that for 32 years, I thought I knew who Russell Keene was. That night, I set a rule for myself that I kept for 36 years. Unless you decide they need to know, nobody finds out what you own. Not friends, not neighbors, and God knows, not even family. Because the second a dollar figure enters the air, everything changes, and you can never go back to the way things were. I kept telling myself I was protecting my kids from that kind of change. You were protecting yourself, I said out loud to the empty kitchen. My own voice startled me. Admit it. I poured the cold coffee down the sink. The winter. Derek turned 25. I made a promise to Vera. We were sitting out on the cold porch watching the snow fall over the ridge, and I told her, when Derek turns 30, I'm going to sit him down and lay it all out. August's land, the holding company, the numbers, everything. Vera looked at me with those steady, clear brown eyes and gave a single nod. Derek turned 30. I looked at my son across the Thanksgiving dinner table and thought, not yet. He's still trying to find his footing. The next year, he turned 35. I watched him talking on his phone in the driveway on Christmas, laughing at something, and thought he seemed distracted. Better to wait. Then he was 38. Somewhere between 30 and 38, that window of opportunity I kept waiting for had quietly closed, and I didn't even realize it was gone until it was too late. One thing I did do was pay for his education. In 2009, Derek got accepted into the MBA program at Denver University. He called me on a Friday night, his voice raspy, with an emotion somewhere between disbelief and total joy. "Dad," he said. "Dad, I got in." "That's incredible," I told him. "I'm proud of you, son." I hung up, walked out the back door, and stood in the freezing February yard. The mountains were darkening above the tree line. I let the feeling rise up in my chest until my eyes burned and my shoulders shook. I broke down. Right there in the dark where nobody could see me. The following Monday, I called Hollis Wayne and had him transfer $140,000 straight to the Denver University bursar's office, paying the full tuition up front. No names attached to the account. Just a direct third-party payment. Fully clean, with the IRS with zero tax consequences, since it went directly to an educational institution. All Derek saw was a zero balance on his account. He never saw where the money came from. He never asked either. I told myself that was just him being humble. Standing in the kitchen at midnight, I finally admitted to myself what it really was. It was a son who had learned not to look too closely at the things his father didn't explain, and I was the one who taught him that. Every year I stayed quiet. I reinforced that lesson. Outside, the snow was still falling. Somewhere up on the ridge, Coldwater Ridge Lodge sat dark and silent, waiting for tomorrow evening like a stage, waiting for the curtain to rise. I rinsed my cup, turned off the light, and went upstairs to lie down beside my sleeping wife, completely unable to close my eyes. I lay there thinking about all the paths I had chosen not to walk. I was the one who had opened the door for Russell Keene. For 36 years, I told myself I would never make that mistake again. Never let the wrong person get close enough to see the whole picture. But I never accounted for the possibility that the door might be opened from the inside by someone I loved, someone who had no idea what he was letting in. 4.5 years ago, on a Wednesday in October, Derek called. His voice had a brightness to it I hadn't heard in a long time. "Dad, I want to bring someone home for Thanksgiving," he said. "Her name is Lacey. Her family's in Denver. I think you'll really like her." After I hung up, Vera looked over at me from the kitchen counter, raising her eyebrows just a quarter of an inch. "He sounds like himself again," she said. "The old version of him." "Yeah," I agreed. "He does." Thanksgiving that year was uncharacteristically mild for November. The snow hadn't started yet. A cold front had passed through, leaving the sky a hard, brilliant blue. Derek arrived on Wednesday evening in a rental car, that was far nicer than anything my son had ever driven, with Lacey Pruitt sitting in the passenger seat. Lacey was 32, blonde, with a polished edge that didn't come from a salon, but from growing up in a family that viewed status as a requirement. She shook my hand firmly, looked me straight in the eye, and said it was a pleasure to meet me. She was polite. But within the first 20 minutes, she was also quietly sizing up my house. I caught her eyes scanning the kitchen cabinets, the aging appliances, and the single-pane windows I'd been meaning to replace since 2015. Vera noticed it too. I could tell by the overly deliberate way she set her dish towel down. Lacey's parents arrived Thursday morning. Her father, Garrett Pruitt, pulled up in a Cadillac Escalade with Colorado plates. He stepped out wearing a vest, layered over a flannel shirt. The kind of look a man wears when he wants to seem approachable, but can't quite pull it off. He was 60, broad-shouldered, with silver hair. And he gave the kind of handshake meant to establish dominance right out of the gate. "Garrett Pruitt," he said, gripping my hand tight. "Good to finally meet you, Cormac. Derek talks about you all the time." When he said my name, something flickered across his face. Just a slight shift, a subtle moment of confirmation, like a man verifying something he hadn't been entirely sure about. I filed it away in my mind, wondering what it meant. Nadine Pruitt stepped out from the passenger side with a warm smile, holding a foil-covered casserole dish. She was the kind of woman who immediately offers to help in the kitchen the second she steps into someone's house. Vera took to her right away. I could see it. Dinner went smoothly. Derek was more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. His shoulders dropped, and he reached across the table to pour Lacey's water without being prompted. I watched my son, trying to hold on to that moment, trying not to focus on the other things I was noticing. Garrett brought up the resort 3 times, never directly, but smoothly, the way a man gathers intelligence while pretending to make casual conversation. "You've been at Coldwater Ridge a long time, haven't you, Cormac?" That was the first time. "Gorgeous property up there. Do you know the ownership group personally?" That was the second. "Derek tells me you've handled the maintenance operations there for decades. You must know every inch of that place." That was the third. Every time I kept my answers short and simple. "Yes. A long time. No, I don't know them personally. And yes, I know the layout pretty well." Each time, Garrett just nodded and steered the conversation somewhere else. After dinner, Derek and Garrett stepped out onto the front porch with their coffee cups. Nora, who had driven in from Durango for the holiday, walked over to the kitchen window and stood next to me. We watched the two of them through the glass. Garrett was leaning against the railing, gesturing as he spoke. Derek was nodding along intently, the way young men do when they think they've found a mentor with absolute confidence. "Dad," Nora said, under her breath, "I don't like him. Garrett, I mean. He asked 3 different questions about you tonight, specifically about you. Not the family, just you." She gripped her mug until her knuckles turned white. It felt like he was running a background check. I looked at my daughter. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's instincts. In 33 years, she hadn't been wrong about a person once. "I'll keep an eye on it," I said. Nora let out a quiet scoff, which meant she had already moved past watching and on to being suspicious. But she let it drop. Later that night, after the Pruitts had headed back to their hotel and Derek was asleep in his old room, Vera came into the kitchen. She sat down across from me, folding her hands on the table. "The way Garrett Pruitt looked at this house," she said, was like a man figuring out how much it's worth to buy up. My chest tightened, that heavy feeling you get when someone voices a thought you've been trying to ignore. I know, I replied. He knows who you are, Cormac. Her voice was quiet, completely certain. I don't know how he figured it out, but he knows. I sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the first dustings of the season's snow began to fall, soft, hesitant flakes that melted the second they touched the warm pavement. I'll call Hollis tomorrow, I said. Vera nodded and went up to bed. I stayed at the table watching the snow fail to stick, replaying the look on Garrett Pruitt's face when he first said my name. That quiet moment of confirmation. He knew exactly whose hand he was shaking. The question that kept me sitting at that table until 2 in the morning was simple, and it didn't have a good answer. What was he planning to do with that information? The Monday after Thanksgiving, Hollis Wayne called me. I ran some checks on Garrett Pruitt, he said. Background, business history, public records. Over the last 20 years, he stepped in as general manager at 3 different resort properties. Hollis paused. It didn't end well for the owners in any of those cases. 2 were forced to sell under heavy pressure, and 1 was taken over entirely. He's very good at what he does, Cormac. I just want you to understand what his track record looks like. I thanked him, hung up, and stood by my office window staring out at the mountains for a long time. In the end, I didn't take action. Derek was happier than I had seen him in years, and I told myself that happiness deserved a chance before I involved lawyers. That was the first real mistake of that season. It wouldn't be the last. By Thanksgiving 3 years ago, Derek came home alone. Lacey and her parents were in Aspen. He arrived in the late afternoon, quieter than usual, carrying a kind of restless tension that meant his mind was miles away. The 4 of us ate at the kitchen table. Vera, Derek, Nora, who had driven up from Durango again, and me. Owen was in Portland, and Paige was finishing her final semester in Denver, so neither of them could make it. After dinner, Derek and I stepped out onto the cold back porch, just like we always did. The sky had cleared, and the stars over the San Juan Mountains looked impossibly sharp against the black. Dad, Derek said, I want you to know something. I want you to be able to rest easy. You've worked hard your whole life, and I think it's time. You took it easy. My chest tightened. I looked at my son's profile in the dim light. The line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. These were details I'd watched change over a lifetime, starting from when he was an 8-year-old standing in the snow with freezing hands. I'm doing fine, son, I said. I know you are. He turned to look at me. It's just, I'm in a position to step up now. You don't have to carry everything by yourself anymore. I stared at him for a moment. He was completely sincere. Whatever else was going on beneath the surface, every word coming out of my son's mouth was genuine. I appreciate that, I said. Thank you, Derek. He nodded, and we went back inside. That was the last real conversation we ever had. Before Nora drove back to Durango after the holiday, she pulled me aside by her car in the driveway. Her breath bloomed in white clouds in the crisp air, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. Dad, I need to tell you something Derek said to me 2 years ago, she said, her jaw tight with the strain of holding it in for so long. We were at a bar in Denver. He'd had a few drinks, and he looked at me and said. She stopped, pressing her lips together. He said, Nora, Dad likes you more than he likes me, because you'd go out and shovel snow with him when I wouldn't. He thinks I'm lazy, and he'll never say it out loud, but I know it. I felt something drop deep in my chest. I told him he was being ridiculous, Nora said, her voice strained. I told him you didn't think that way at all, but he wouldn't hear it. He just kept saying you always looked at him differently. She pulled one hand from her pocket and pressed it against her chest. Dad, I think that's where all of this started. Not Garrett, not Lacey, just that. I stood in the driveway and watched Nora's taillights disappear around the bend. The cold bit through my jacket, pressing hard against my ribs, and I just stood there and let it. For years, my son had believed I loved him less because he didn't want to pick up a shovel, and I had never said a single word to set him straight. That Christmas, Paige drove down from Denver. She was 29, the youngest, with her mother's blunt nature and a habit of asking the exact questions everyone else was trying to avoid. We were doing the dishes after dinner, just the two of us, while Vera and Derek were in the other room. Dad, Paige said, drying a pot without looking at me. Can I ask you something weird? Go ahead. Is there something you're not telling us? She shot me a quick glance before looking back at the pot. Not like a health thing or anything, just something. I've always had this feeling like there's a room in this house I've never been allowed to go into. My throat went dry. I turned off the tap. Paige, you don't need to. She set the pot on the rack, wiped her hands on the towel, and finally looked straight at me. She had Vera's eyes, steady, perceptive, and far too sharp. I just wanted you to know that I noticed. I'm just an old guy who likes shoveling snow, I said softly. She looked at me for 3 long seconds. Then she offered a quiet smile. Not because she believed me, but because she was choosing to let it go for now, and walked out to join her mother. I stood by the sink, holding the damp dishcloth, thinking about that hidden room she'd described. I was the one who had built those walls, brick by brick, year after year, out of unanswered questions and heavy silence. And now my youngest daughter had walked right up to the door, knocked on it, and I had just smiled and told her there was nothing inside. Later that night, the snow started falling again. I watched it from the kitchen window, thinking about what Nora had told me in the driveway about the bar in Denver and the shovel. In trying so hard to protect my children from the weight of wealth, my silence had ended up causing far deeper damage. Spring came late to Telluride that year. By the second week of March, Hollis Wayne called me again. It wasn't the calm, routine call of a lawyer passing along minor updates. It was the tone of a man who had uncovered hard facts and was measuring his words with absolute precision. Cormac, he said, I need you to come to my office. Not over the phone. In person. I drove into town the next morning. Hollis had been handling my legal affairs for 33 years. He was 61, lean, with silvering temples, and an unhurried composure. He understood that when things get serious, clarity matters far more than speed. His office still smelled the same as it always had. Old paper and black coffee. He waited for me to sit down, then opened a thick folder and slid it across the desk toward me. Someone has been quietly digging into the ownership structure of Strand Mountain Holdings, he said. It's not a government inquiry. It's private research, pulling public records and trying to get hands on internal documents. He tapped the top page. The paper trail leads straight back to a law firm in Denver. Their client is Garrett Pruitt. My jaw set. I had been expecting something like this, but I hadn't anticipated just how organized it would be. How long? I asked. As far as I can tell, 8 months, maybe longer. Hollis folded his hands on the desk. There's a document here, Cormac. A full transfer of operational rights and asset management. Pruitt's attorneys drafted it. Your name is listed on the signature line. The date field is blank. The office went completely silent. Outside, the last remnants of winter ice were slowly dripping from the eaves. He's been preparing this for 8 months, I said. At least, Hollis replied. This isn't an impulse move. It's a calculated strategy with a timeline. I leaned back in my chair, thinking back 4 years to Garrett Pruitt, sitting at my Thanksgiving table, asking those 3 carefully disguised questions. The subtle look of confirmation when he first heard my name, the way he evaluated my home. He had known who I was from the very beginning, and he'd been laying the groundwork ever since. There's more, Hollis said, pulling out a second sheet. Pruitt has been in direct contact with a real estate investment group out of Denver called Meridian Property Group. He's been feeding them internal operational data for Coldwater Ridge, occupancy rates, revenue figures, infrastructure assessments. Hollis looked at me gravely. He's providing all of this as if he has the authority to negotiate on behalf of the property. He doesn't. He's trying to position my resort for a buyout, I said. 6 weeks ago, he went so far as to sign a preliminary letter of intent with Meridian. Hollis continued. Under Colorado law, that is a direct breach of his fiduciary duty as general manager. He owes a legal duty of loyalty to Strand Mountain Holdings, not to his own interests. What he's doing opens him up to severe civil liability for interference with business operations. If Meridian took action based on that document, it could lead to massive legal claims. I took a moment to process it all. 8 months of preparation. A drafted transfer agreement with my name on it. A signed letter of intent with a Denver investment group. Garrett Pruitt wasn't just planning to push me out. He intended to sell off everything I had built before I even had a chance to say no. How do you want to handle this? Hollis asked. I want to wait, I said. Hollis's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Cormac, you have clear legal grounds to terminate his contract today. You have more than enough to file a civil suit immediately. You don't need to wait for anything. I need to know where Derek stands in all of this, I said, my voice dropping lower than I intended. I need to know if my son is walking into this with his eyes wide open, or if Garrett is keeping him in the dark and using him as a pawn. I looked across the desk at Hollis, because those are 2 entirely different situations, and I won't treat them the same until I know the truth. Hollis looked at me for a long time. Then he gave a single, slow nod. I'll keep monitoring everything closely, he said. If there's any sudden movement, call me day or night. There's one more thing, I added. I reached into my coat and pulled out the small, worn notebook I had carried with me ever since my father passed away. The leather cover was scuffed, the pages soft from years of use. I flipped to an entry from 2019 and laid it on the desk in front of Hollis. In my own handwriting, there was a figure written out, $40 million. Below it was a single sentence. This wasn't land August would ever sell. It isn't mine to sell either. It belongs to Telluride. Hollis read the line, then looked up at me. Garrett never knew about that offer in 2019. I said. If he did, he'd understand one simple fact. I picked up the notebook and slid it back into my pocket. This property is not for sale, not to Meridian, and not to anyone else. And the man who thinks he's about to hand it over to a Denver firm is going to find that out in a room full of 80 people. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and walked out into the crisp March air. Behind me, I heard Hollis pick up his phone. 3 weeks after I walked out of Hollis's office, Derek called me on a Tuesday morning in late March. I was out on the eastern cabin loop, replacing a broken door latch, the icy wind biting at my face. The phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled off my work glove and checked the screen. Derek. I set the latch down on the snow and answered. Dad here. His voice hit me like a door opening into a warm room. Bright, full, the way he used to sound back in college when he'd call, just to keep me on the line for 20 minutes, about nothing at all. Dad, I've got news. Great news. Tell me, I said. Garrett gave me the general manager position at Coldwater Ridge. The words came tumbling out, fast and tangled together. The way he used to sound when he was a kid, reporting something he could hardly believe himself. Full-time GM, salary, benefits, complete oversight of all 3 departments. Dad, this is everything I've been working toward. I stood out in the snow with that broken door latch in my hand, letting my son's happiness travel through the phone and settle into my chest, right alongside everything else I was carrying. That's a big job, I said. I know it is, but Garrett says I'm ready. He's been watching how I handle things for 2 years, and he says I've got the instincts for it. Derek's voice softened just a bit. I wanted you to hear it first, before anybody else. I'm glad you called me, I said. Are you proud of me, Dad? The question dropped with the full weight of 40 years behind it. The boy on the phone was the same boy who had stood in the snow at 8 years old, hands turned white, refusing to come inside. I've always been proud of you, I said. Always. He made a small noise that wasn't quite a word, and hung up a moment later. I stood in the biting wind holding the phone for a long time. Then I put my gloves back on and picked up the latch. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 6 months earlier I had called Garrett Pruitt myself. It was a Sunday morning in November, 2 days after that first Thanksgiving with the Pruitts, after I'd watched Garrett ask those 3 careful questions and look at my house like he was taking inventory. I made that call before Hollis discovered the drafted transfer agreement. Before I knew the full extent of what Garrett was planning, I made it because Derek had been adrift for years, and I didn't know how to reach him with words anymore. So I tried the only other language I had. Give him a real shot, I told Garrett during that call. Give him real responsibility. Let him prove himself. Garrett had agreed without hesitation. Of course he had. I was his boss. He couldn't have said no to me, even if he wanted to. What I hadn't understood then was that he was already planning to use Derek as a tool in his scheme, and my phone call had simply handed him the handle pointed straight in his direction. I fixed the latch and walked back to the maintenance shed. Frank Odell was inside, sharpening a plow blade, the metal grinding noise filling the small room. Derek got the GM job, I said. Frank set the blade down and looked at me. Garrett gave it to him? Yeah. Frank's mouth set into a hard, straight line. You going to tell Derek? Not yet. Frank picked the blade back up and went back to work. You know how this ends if you wait too long? He wasn't accusing me, just stating a simple fact. I know, I said. On Derek's first day as general manager, I drove up to the resort at 7 a.m, just like every other day. I parked in the maintenance lot, grabbed my shovel, and cleared the front walk, the east path, and the drain. At 9 o'clock, a sleek black SUV pulled into the main guest lot. Derek stepped out wearing a charcoal wool coat that cost more than I spend on clothes in a year. He stood at the entrance of the main lodge, looking up at the structure with the expression of a man who had finally arrived where he belonged. He didn't look toward the maintenance lot. I watched him from the far end of the snow, holding my shovel, feeling a strange mix of emotions moving through me. Pride and sorrow, pressed so close together you couldn't separate one from the other. That afternoon, Lacey came by for a tour. Derek walked her through the main lodge, the dining rooms, and the banquet hall. I was down in the utility corridor, replacing a water pipe fitting. As they passed the open doorway, Lacey glanced in, saw me crouched on the floor with a wrench, and said, without dropping her voice, "Is that the maintenance guy your dad knows?" Derek looked in. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he turned away. "That's my dad," he said. Lacey didn't slow her pace. "Oh," she said, using that tone people use when they've decided a subject is finished. I went back to the pipe. My hands were steady, but my jaw was tight. 10 minutes later, Frank appeared in the hallway, carrying a cup of coffee. He didn't say anything, just handed it to me. I took it and stood in the corridor drinking it, while the quiet click of Lacey's heels faded further up the hall. That evening, Owen called from Portland to congratulate his brother. Then he called me. "Hey, Dad." His voice was careful, the way it always was when he was trying to figure something out. "I heard about Derek. Good for him." "Yeah," I said. A pause lingered on the line. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." 3 years ago, I applied for an operations coordinator spot at Coldwater Ridge. I never got a call back, not even a rejection letter. Another pause. "Did you know about that?" My throat went tight, a sharp, aching knot. "I heard about it after the fact," I said carefully. "I'm sorry, Owen. That shouldn't have happened." Owen was quiet for a long moment. "Right," he finally said, his tone making it clear that things weren't right at all, though he chose not to push further. "Well, I love you, Dad." "Love you too, son." After hanging up, I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time. The mountains had gone dark. The resort lights were visible up on the ridge, warm and golden against the night sky. One of my sons was running a property he didn't realize belonged to his father. My other son had been quietly shut out by his brother and hadn't known why for 3 years, and hadn't known for 3 years. And my youngest daughter had asked me a question at the kitchen sink, only for me to smile and pretend nothing was wrong. Sitting there in the dark, I finally saw it. What I had built to protect my kids from money had spent years protecting them from each other instead. I didn't go upstairs until 11:30. When I came inside, the house was silent with that specific stillness that only comes with a November night in Telluride. The snow had stopped, the cold had completely settled in, and nothing was moving outside. Not even the wind. I hung up my coat, took off my boots, and turned toward the stairs. The kitchen light was on. Vera was sitting at the table. In front of her, on the wooden surface she had wiped down 1,000 times, lay a small envelope, ivory-colored, the edges slightly yellowed. Across the front, in my father's neat, deliberate handwriting, it said, "Vera Strand." It was the handwriting of a man who had learned to write late in life, and never quite lost the stiffness in his letters. The envelope was open. I stood in the doorway, looking at my wife. She was 65 years old, and her back was as straight as it had been when she was 22. But tonight, something in her shoulders looked different. Not slumped, not broken, just settled, like someone who had finally finished a job she'd been putting off for far too long. "You opened it," I said. 21 years, Cormac." Her voice was steady, but there was a weight beneath it, something heavy that had been sitting there a long time. I decided tonight was the time. I walked over to the table and sat across from her. She slid the envelope toward me. I reached in and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. My father's handwriting, thinner than I remembered, uneven. The writing of a man who was already sick when he sat down to pen it. Vera T., you're the one holding that family together. I've watched it for 19 years, and I want you to know I saw it, even if Cormac doesn't say it out loud. He loves you the way men like us love. Completely, but mostly in silence. I'm sorry I passed that flaw down to my son. I need you to do something for me. When the time comes, and you'll know when it's time, don't let him keep waiting. He'll always find a reason to wait. He waited on the land. He waited on the lodge. He waited on every hard conversation he ever needed to have. That's just who he is. You're the one who has to tell him the waiting is over. This envelope is yours. Open it whenever you need to, or don't open it at all. But if you ever need permission to push him, this is it. August, I laid the letter back on the table. The kitchen felt small and warm. Outside, the mountains were invisible in the dark. I only knew their shapes were there because I'd lived with them my whole life. He knew you pretty well, I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. He knew both of us, Vera said. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, not gently but firmly, with the strength of a woman who had made up her mind. Cormac, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. All right? Before tonight, did you know what Garrett was doing? I looked at my wife's face, at the lines around her eyes, at her set mouth. Since March, I said. An expression passed over her face, not anger, but something more complex than anger. A tired, quiet understanding. 8 months, she said. I needed to know if Derek... I know why you waited. Her hand pressed down harder on mine. Cormac. Whether Derek walked into that man's plan with his eyes open or closed, you waiting 8 months didn't change the outcome. It just gave Garrett 8 more months to set his trap. The truth of it hit me right in the chest. You're right, I said. I know I'm right. She pulled her hand back and folded both hands in her lap. So tomorrow, you walk into that room, and you represent everything Auguette built, and everything you built on top of it. You do not let that man hand your son a pen and watch him sign away what your father dug out of the frozen ground. I looked at my wife for a long time, 39 years. The diner in 1985, every winter since. Hollis is in town, I said. He's been waiting in the lot since 6 tonight. Vera's chin went up just a fraction. Good. I told Frank to keep the audio running. Full recording. Good. I'm not signing anything. I know you're not. She stood up from the table, picked up the letter, and refolded it with care, placing it back in the envelope. Come to bed. Cormac, you need to rest. I watched her walk toward the hallway. At the doorway, she stopped without turning around. August would be proud of you, she said. Not because of what you built, because you still go out every morning and do the work yourself. A short pause. That was always the thing he was proudest of. She went upstairs. I sat alone at the table for a few more minutes, my hands flat on the wooden surface, looking at the spot where the envelope had rested. Then I turned off the kitchen light and followed her up. I didn't sleep. I lay next to Vera, listening to her steady, slow breathing. Watching the ceiling and thinking about my father's handwriting on a piece of paper that had sat in a drawer for 21 years, just waiting for the right moment. Around 3 in the morning, I stopped trying to pretend I was going to sleep and just lay there with my eyes open, letting the thoughts come without pushing them back. At 4, I got up. I dressed in the dark, work pants, thermal layer, the heavy flannel shirt I'd worn, so long the cuffs were frayed at the edges. I carried my boots downstairs and pulled them on in the kitchen so I wouldn't wake Vera. Coat on, reaching by the back door for the thing I always reached for. August's shovel. Ash wood handle, iron blade, worn smooth and tilted slightly to the left from 40 years of heavy use. It was the most familiar object I owned. I stepped outside. The Telluride cold hit me the way it always does in November. Not gradually, but all at once, like stepping into icy water. The thermometer on the porch post read 12 degrees. The sky was that deep, absolute black that only exists between 3 and 5 in the morning, before even the faintest hint of gray touches the edges of the mountains. 2 inches of fresh powder had accumulated overnight. The driveway was a clean, unbroken sheet of white. I started at the top of the front walk and worked my way down to the road. Push, lift, guide. The exact same movements my father had taught me when I was 7 years old, standing in the same cold, in the same dark, on a patch of ground he was just beginning to realize would become something real. In the quiet, I heard his voice, the way I sometimes do when it's very cold and very dark and there's no one else around. Don't fight the snow, Cormac. Guide it. There's a difference. I stopped my work, standing in the dark with both hands wrapped around the ash handle, the cold pressing hard against my face. I let the memory of that voice settle over me. Derek had never learned to move snow properly. He'd always push straight ahead, the way people do when they haven't been taught, and the snow would pile up and fall back over the blade, and he'd get frustrated and drop the shovel. I tried to teach him once. He was around 12. He looked at me with that specific expression 12-year-old boys get when they've decided a lesson isn't worth the effort, and I didn't push it. I'd always let things go too easily with Derek, backing down when I should have held my ground and worked through the friction. A man's whole pattern usually shows up in the small things, if you know how to look for it. I finished the front walk, moved to the side path, then to the steps leading down to the back deck where the drifts always piled deep in the north corner. The work warmed me from the inside out, the way physical labor always does. A deep heat starting in the shoulders, working down through the arms and chest, finally settling into something quiet and steady. I was finishing the last back step when the kitchen light came on. A minute later, the back door opened and Vera stepped out. She was wearing her heavy coat and the fleece cap, with the ear flaps she'd had since the early 90s. The one she refused to replace because she said it still worked. She held 2 mugs in her hands. She walked across the deck and handed me one without saying a word. I took it, feeling the heat seep through my gloves. We stood side by side on the back deck in the dark at 5 in the morning, looking out toward the mountains we couldn't see, but knew were there all the same. It's the same way you know the people who have been in your life for a long time, even when you can't see them clearly. You can feel their presence. I waited for the wrong reasons, I said, my breath turning to a thick white cloud in the freezing air. Not just these 8 months, all of it. Derek should have known whose property he was running the day he stepped into that resort. He should have known years ago. Yes, Vera said. She didn't soften her tone. She never did. If I had told him, I stopped, then started over. If I'd kept my promise and sat him down when he turned 30, none of this would have happened. Garrett wouldn't have had an opening. Maybe, Vera said quietly. Or maybe Derek would have found another way to become the man he's becoming right now. You don't know. She gripped her mug with both hands. The only thing you know for sure is tonight. I looked at the mountain silhouette, growing just a fraction lighter against the dark sky. I'm not afraid of tonight, I said. I know you're not, She turned her head toward me, her face barely visible in the faint glow coming through the kitchen window. "Are you afraid of Derek?" The question took a moment to settle in. "I'm afraid of looking at him," I said, "and not finding the boy who stood in the snow with white hands." My throat tightened on the words. That's what I'm afraid of. Not losing the resort, losing the version of him I've been holding on to all these years. Vera reached out her free hand and laid it on my arm, heavy and warm through my coat. "You might have already lost him," she said softly. "That version might already be gone. But tonight, you go find out what's left, and whatever is left, that's what you face." We finished our coffee and went back inside. I showered and changed into the clothes I'd laid out the night before. Not a suit. I didn't own one that fit anymore. Dark trousers, a collared shirt, and the good boots I wore for formal occasions. Vera adjusted my collar in front of the hallway mirror, just like she had for 39 years before every important moment we'd faced together. "Ready?" she asked. I reached into my coat pocket, feeling the worn leather cover of the small notebook against my fingertips. "Ready," I said. I opened the back door for her. We walked out together, through the snow I'd cleared before dawn, leaving 2 sets of tracks across the fresh white surface toward the truck. I turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life, the heater slowly blowing warm air. The drive to Coldwater Ridge Lodge takes 11 minutes. I've driven that road 10,000 times, but tonight it felt like the first time, and the last, all pressed into those same 11 minutes. Out of habit, I pulled into the maintenance lot and cut the engine. Through the windshield, the main lodge glowed with golden light against the November dusk. Warm, full, and impressive. It's the kind of beauty a place has when you've built it with your own hands and know every single scar underneath the surface. I sat there for a moment with my hands resting on my knees. Then I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the light. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the banquet hall was the flowers. Tall, lush white arrangements sat on every single table, the kind of display designed to make a statement about money. They were impressive, but after 30 years of working here, I knew for a fact they hadn't come from our usual supplier. Someone had brought them in from the outside, determined to make their own mark on the room. Garrett Pruitt had been redecorating my banquet hall. Vera held my arm as we walked past the entrance. The room was already 3/4 full, 80 well-dressed guests moving between tables. The steady hum of conversation filling the air, that low, their confident noise an important event. The lighting was low and warm. The chandeliers had been dimmed to a flattering, golden glow that softened the slight wear on the carpet near the east wall, where I'd been planning to replace since last spring. I had personally chosen every single light fixture in this room. I knew where every wire ran behind those walls. Our seats were at a table near the very back. I noted it without letting anything show on my face, stepping forward to pull out Vera's chair. "Maintenance staff in the back row," she murmured under her breath as she sat down. "Best view in the house," I replied. Frank Odell was already sitting there, 3 tables over. He wore a dark suit that looked like it had been pressed an hour ago. He caught my eye across the room and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, the nod of a man who had completed his assignment and was just waiting for the next step. Good. The audio system was running. Everything was set. I scanned the room out of sheer habit, not as a guest but as the owner. Tables were secure. No tripping hazards near the service corridors. The emergency exit by the east wall was clear. 22 years of Frank's work showed in every clean surface and smoothly running detail. Mayor Patricia Dunn was seated at the head VIP table near the front. She wore a dark blazer, sporting that practiced look government officials used to appear deeply interested at all times. She was in her second term as mayor. I'd only attended one town function during her tenure, and she had once thanked me for supporting the winter employment program, completely unaware that she was speaking to the owner himself. I had intentionally kept it that way. At the table closest to the stage, a young man in his early 30s sat with a camera bag at his feet and a reporter's notebook beside his plate. Marcus Webb. I'd read his byline in the Telluride Daily Planet regularly over the past 4 years. He was thorough, sharp, and fair. The kind of journalist who verified his facts before publishing a story. Garrett had invited him to cover Derek's promotion, expecting a routine story tonight. But he was about to get a very different story tonight. Garrett himself was moving through the crowd with easy grace, like a man who had spent his entire career making people feel like they were the most important person in the room. Handshakes, pats on the shoulder, easy laughter at perfectly timed intervals. He moved through the crowd, and the crowd parted for him. If you didn't know any better, you'd swear he owned the place. Derek stood near the front of the room with Lacey at his side. He was accepting congratulations with a slightly overwhelmed shine in his eyes. The look of a man who hadn't quite processed that all of this was really happening. He looked good. He looked happy. For a second, he looked remarkably like the boy who used to call me from college just to talk. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to take a slow, steady breath. He looks like himself tonight, Vera whispered softly beside me. She saw it too. The good version, I said, using the exact phrase she'd used 4 years ago during our first Thanksgiving with the Pruitts. Just then, Lacey leaned in and whispered something in Derek's ear. His posture immediately stiffened, his shoulders straightening. That genuine shine turned into something managed, deliberate, and staged, and the boy vanished back behind the general manager's mask. Paige appeared at my side out of nowhere. She had driven down from Denver, looking like she'd come straight from work, dressed in professional clothes, her hair still neat. But her eyes, sweeping the room, suspended the room with that familiar sharpness she inherited from her mother. "Dad," she said, leaning in close. "I don't like the way Garrett keeps looking at you." "I know," I said. "He keeps looking over here and then looking away real fast," she said, her lips pressed tight, "like he's double-checking something." "He is," I said. Paige looked at me for a second with those sharp, knowing eyes. Then she spoke real soft. "You're ready for whatever happens tonight, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. "You talked to your brother lately?" I asked her. Her face changed. A mix of hurt and frustration washed over her. "He doesn't call much anymore," she said. "When he does, it's all about the resort, all about what he's working on. He doesn't ask about us anymore." She looked over at Derek across the room. "He didn't used to be like that." "I know," I said. Nora showed up 5 minutes later and sat on the other side of Vera. She reached past her mother and gave my hand a hard, deliberate squeeze without saying a word. She had driven 3 hours from Durango, her jaw set like a woman who had made up her mind about something on the drive down. At 7 o'clock sharp, Garrett Pruitt walked up to the stage. The room fell quiet, the kind of quiet people give to a man who knows how to hold an audience. I watched 80 people lock their attention on him, thinking back to the first time he sat at my Thanksgiving table, asking those 3 careful questions, looking at my home like he was sizing up A number. "Good evening," Garrett said into the microphone, his voice filling my banquet hall life. As if he had been speaking there his whole. "Thank you all for coming out tonight to celebrate a milestone for a fine young man and a new chapter for Coldwater Ridge Lodge." He paused, smiling, letting the weight of the room shift toward him. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the worn cover of August's notebook. Then I picked up the dinner menu and started reading. How did we get here? I spent 40 years trying to keep this from happening. And here it is anyway. Garrett gave 2 toasts. The first was to Coldwater Ridge Lodge, its history, its growth, and its future under new leadership. He talked about the resort like a man talking about something he had earned himself. I sat at my table near the back of my banquet hall, listening to him frame 40 years of my family's life, like it was something that had sprung up the day he signed his employment contract. Vera's hand found my knee under the table. She gave a firm, reassuring squeeze and kept her hand right there. The second toast was to Derek. His vision, his instincts, his readiness. When Garrett raised his glass, Derek stood up, and the whole room followed. For a second, my son looked like everything everyone in that room expected him to be. Tall, confident, lit up by the belief of 79 people all at once. He caught my eye across the room. Just for a second, then he looked away. I raised my glass along with everybody else. Between the salad and the main course, Garrett made his way toward me. I had been watching him walk over for 10 minutes, stopping at tables, chatting, changing directions. The way a man moves when he wants to reach a destination, without looking like he's heading straight for it. He was good at it. I'll give him that. He sat down in the empty chair next to me, relaxed as a friend who had just dropped by to catch up. "Cormac." He set a leather folder on the table between us, resting his hand on top of it. "Good to see you here tonight. Important moment for Derek." "It is," I said. "I wanted to talk to you about a small matter." His voice was warm, unhurried, the tone of a benefactor. "Just a cleanup detail. Something to formalize the management structure moving forward, make Derek's role clearer on paper." He slid the folder toward me and opened the first page. "Simple stuff. Just needs your signature, and we're done." I looked down at the folder, then I picked it up. I read the first page, slowly, then the second. Halfway down the third page, I found what I was looking for. My name was printed on the signature line. Cormac J. Strand. The date line beside it was blank. That document had been waiting a long time for this moment. I could tell by the crisp paper and the precise formatting. It had been prepared carefully by an insider. Under my name, the text was plain enough for anyone to read. Relinquishes all rights, interest, and claims of ownership regarding Strand Mountain Holdings LLC and its subsidiaries, including Coldwater Ridge Lodge, transferring full operational authority jointly to Derek Allen Strand and Lacey Ann Pruitt. Jointly? Not just Derek, Lacey too. I set the folder down on the table and looked at Garrett. "I'll need to read this over carefully," I said. His smile didn't slip. "Of course, take your time." He stood up and adjusted his jacket. "Don't take too long though, Cormac. Tonight's a celebration. No need to let paperwork slow things down." He walked off toward another table, easy and unhurried, like he had just asked me to sign a birthday card. I sat there with the folder in front of me and took a slow breath. Vera leaned in. "What is it?" "Everything," I said quietly. "The whole company transferred jointly to Derek and Lacey." I turned the folder so she could see the page. "Drafted months ago. My name's already on it. Her breath came out, slow and controlled. She looked at that page for a long time. Then she looked at me. She understood. I closed the folder. Across the room, Derek was laughing at something. A guest had a hand on Lacey's chair. It was the most relaxed Derek had looked in years. Then Garrett touched his arm, whispered something in his ear, and Derek's posture shifted. A subtle square of his shoulders, a tight jaw. The look of a man reminded of a job he had been putting off. He excused himself from the guests. He picked up his champagne glass. He started walking toward my table. My heart didn't race. It just sank, heavy, and like something you already knew was dropping, and you had accepted its fall. Owen saw him coming. He set his fork down and sat up straight in his chair. Nora's hand froze on her wine glass. Paige looked from me to her brother, her face growing dead serious. Derek stopped at the edge of our table. He stood there for a moment, looking down at me with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before. Something between determination and deep unease. It was the look of a man who had built a narrative in his head about what he was doing and had shouted that story so loud inside his own mind that he couldn't hear anything else. Dad. His voice was louder than the table needed. People at nearby tables turned their heads. Dad, I need you to sign this tonight. It's time. He set his champagne glass on the table, his hand not entirely steady. You've been hovering long enough. I don't need you looking over my shoulder anymore. This is my career now, my future. Sign the paper and let me move on with my life. He pulled the folder out from in front of me and flipped to the signature page. He held it out. His jaw was tight. His eyes had a dark glint that had nothing to do with joy. Sign it, Dad. His voice went up another notch, and the surrounding tables fell quiet. That silence spread outward like a stone dropped in water, until the nearest third of the room stopped talking and turned to look. You've been a burden long enough. We're adults. We don't need a handyman following us around. His voice cracked slightly on those last words, and he covered it up with volume. He slapped the folder down hard on the table in front of me, pointing right at the signature line. Sign it. You've been nothing but a parasite your entire life. You always have been. Parasite. The word hung in the room like a physical blow. The music from the speakers kept playing for 3 long seconds. Then somebody near the soundboard must have noticed, because the sound faded down to nothing. The room went completely silent. The absolute quiet that only happens when something irreversible has just taken place. 80 people, not a single fork moving, not a glass raised. I looked at my son. He stood over me, finger pressed against the signature line, face flushed, hands still trembling slightly. I felt something move through me that wasn't anger, and wasn't sadness either, but something far older than both. The specific ache of a man watching his absolute worst fear come to life right in front of him. I looked down at the folder. Then I looked up at Derek. I reached out for the folder. My hand closed over it. Not the pen, the folder. I pulled it toward me, opened the first page, and started reading out loud. I didn't shout. I didn't stand up. I just read in the same voice I used when checking a maintenance log or going over a supply invoice. Steady, clear, unhurried. The text of that document filled the silent banquet hall, spreading out like water seeking every corner. Transfer agreement, I read. Made between Cormac J. Strand, hereinafter referred to as the transferor, and Derek Allen Strand, and Lacey Ann Pruitt, hereinafter referred to as the transferees, whereas the transferor agrees to surrender all ownership rights, interest, and claims regarding Strand Mountain Holdings LLC, including but not limited to Coldwater Ridge Lodge, and all associated property, revenue, and contractual agreements. I looked up. "That's me," I said to the room. "The transferor, everything I own, handed over tonight." Derek's face flushed darker. Garrett had stepped up to the edge of the table, standing just behind Derek's right shoulder. His face was going through a complicated shift, the controlled look of a man recalculating everything in real time. I turned back to the folder and kept reading. Right then, the chair next to Garrett scraped hard against the floor. Vera stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 39 years of marriage had given her a register below a shout that carried farther than one ever could. When she spoke, every table nearby heard every single word. "Derek Allen Strand," she said. "You look at me right now." Derek turned. Some of the arrogance drained out of his face as he met his mother's eyes, like a flame dying down in a sudden draft. "You called your father a parasite," Vera said. "In a building he built in front of 80 people. Her voice didn't shake. It was the steadiest thing in the room. "I want you to think very carefully about what you just said. And I want you to think about who taught you to use that word, and why." Derek opened his mouth. Vera raised one hand, not aggressive, just decisive, and he closed it again. Owen was up before anyone saw him move. He walked around the table fast, and for a second I thought he was going to put himself physically between Derek and me. But he stopped 2 feet away, turning to face his brother. When he spoke, his voice had a raw edge that belonged to a man who had kept something quiet for a long time and had no room left to hold it in. "You know what?" Owen said, his jaw so tight the words came out clipped. "For 6 years I've been sending Mom and Dad $800 a month." His hands were at his sides, shaking, not from anger, but from the effort of keeping it in check. 6 years, Derek. Because I thought Dad was struggling. Because I thought he was just a handyman trying to make ends meet, and I didn't want them doing without. He took a step closer to his brother. "And you had every advantage I didn't, and you stand there tonight thanking Garrett Pruitt for giving you a career without saying Dad's name a single time." Derek stared at his brother. Something shifted behind his eyes. A brief flicker of real understanding. Then Garrett laid a hand on Derek's shoulder, and that flicker vanished. Nora didn't stand up. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, turned on the camera, and held it pointed straight at Derek and Garrett without saying a word. "Put that away," Derek said. "Keep talking," Nora said, her voice flat, her hand rock steady. "I'm listening." Paige was already gone from the table. I hadn't seen her leave, but I heard the banquet hall doors open and close, and I knew where she'd gone. 2 minutes later, the doors opened again, and she came back with her phone in her hand. She looked across the table at me with her mother's eyes and said, "He's coming in, Dad. Hollis." I gave her a single, tight nod. At the end of the table, Garrett stood up straight, making his recalculation. He stepped past Derek, facing the room with the composure of a man trying to regain control of a situation that had drifted off script. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who had managed rooms for 30 years. "I apologize for this interruption. This is a private family matter, and we will address it privately." He looked at me with a flat, direct gaze. "Cormac, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. You know as well as I do how this ends. Sign the document tonight, and we can all go home." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pen, holding it out across the table toward me. 80 people watched that pen hover in the air between us. I looked at the pen. I looked at Garrett's hand holding it. I thought back to the quiet look of confirmation on his face, the first time he heard my name. That subtle click of recognition. He had known from the very beginning. He had spent 4 years preparing for this exact moment, this pen, in this room. And he stood there now with absolute certainty, as if he had never considered that when his hand closed, the prize he thought he was grabbing might not be there at all. I laid both hands flat on the table. "I'd like to finish reading the rest of the document," I said. Garrett's jaw tightened just a fraction. "Cormac, read it out loud," I said to everyone in the room. The pen stayed, floating in the air. Garrett didn't move. From somewhere near the back of the room, the banquet hall doors opened one last time. I heard the specific sound I'd known for 33 years. Leather shoe soles striking hardwood flooring. Hollis Wayne had arrived. Hollis Wayne walked like a man who had nowhere urgent to be, and no need to make an entrance. He moved unhurried through the banquet hall doors, holding his small leather briefcase in one hand, his other hand free. He didn't look at Garrett. He didn't look at Derek, didn't look at the folder on the table, or the pen still hovering between Garrett's fingers. He looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He pulled out a chair at the nearest empty table, set his briefcase down, and stood beside it without opening it. Garrett watched him walk across the room, the pen still in his hand. The certainty he had carried into my banquet hall was still stamped on his face, but underneath it, something had cracked. A subtle tightening around the eyes, a rapid recalculation behind the expression. He recognized Hollis. I knew he would. 8 months of digging into Strand Mountain Holdings meant he'd hit Hollis Wayne's name on every single major filing. Garrett knew exactly who had just walked into the room. He recovered faster than I expected. "Cormac." His voice radiated professional warmth, the polished tone of a man who had managed difficult rooms for 30 years. He turned slightly so the nearby tables could hear him, making the moment public and reasonable. "This is a straightforward document. Your son deserves clarity about his future. A supportive father would sign the paper and let the boy move forward with his life." He set the pen down on the table in front of me with a soft, precise click. "You don't have any reasonable alternatives tonight." The room held its breath, leaning into the outcome it had been expecting all evening. Derek's shoulders dropped just a fraction. Garrett's jaw relaxed a degree. At the back table, Frank Odell sat with his hands flat, every line of his body perfectly still. I let my fingers hover over the pen. I thought about August, standing on the frozen ground in 1974, looking out at nothing and seeing everything. I thought about Derek at 8 years old, refusing to come inside from the snow. I thought about the notebook in my coat pocket, with $40 million written down, and a single sentence below it. Not land August would ever sell. Not mine to sell either. Then I laid the pen down. I didn't sign, just placed it flat on the table, parallel to the document. I looked up at Garrett. "I'd like to hear what my attorney has to say first," I said. Garrett's expression didn't shatter, but something behind it gave way. A hairline crack invisible to most, but clear as glass to me. Hollis stepped forward from the table where he stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Before any documents are signed tonight," Hollis said, "I want to clarify the legal status of the paper in front of Mr. Strand." He opened his briefcase, pulled out a single sheet, and laid it on the table next to the transfer agreement. Under Colorado law, the transfer of ownership in a limited liability company requires at minimum, notarized signatures, independent legal counsel for the transferring party, and a full disclosure of the company's current valuation. He looked down at the document on the table. This document has none of those. Furthermore, it's being presented to Mr. Strand in a public setting, under clear family and social pressure, following a direct verbal assault on his character. He looked right at Garrett. That combination meets the statutory definition of duress under Colorado law. Any signature obtained under duress is voidable by the signing party at any time. It holds zero legal weight. Absolute silence fell over the room. Additionally, Hollis continued, his voice remaining calm, precise, and unhurried throughout. I've reviewed the document itself. The transfer terms are structured not merely to convey management authority, but complete ownership. This is not a cleanup document. It is a full transfer of a private company currently valued at. He glanced down at his paper. $94 million. $94 million. The number hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. You could watch it ripple outward, heads turning slightly, postures adjusting by instinct, the air itself changing quality. Derek was still holding his champagne glass. He set it down on the nearest surface, without even looking at it. His eyes locked on Hollis. Garrett's voice came out lower than before, stripped clean of its warmth. This is a private family matter. Your involvement. I represent Strand Mountain Holdings, LLC. Hollis said smoothly. That makes my involvement professional, not personal. He looked at Garrett with the steady, patient gaze of a man who had spent 33 years in the exact same jurisdiction. And I think the people in this room should know a few other things as well. Mayor Patricia Dunn set her water glass down at the head VIP table. Marcus Webb's pen hadn't moved in 2 minutes. Frank Odell was watching Garrett with the quiet look of a man who had waited a long time to see a debt settled. Garrett looked across the table at me. For the first time since he sat down beside me with that leather folder, I saw something on his face that wasn't calculation. It was the look of a man who had just realized the room he thought he controlled had never belonged to him at all. Cormac, he said. Just my name, with nothing behind it. Let him speak, I said. Hollis didn't rush. 33 years as an attorney had taught him that the value of information isn't just in the facts themselves, but in the delivery, giving it space to land, letting the silence settle so the room can digest what it just heard. He stood at the edge of the table, unbuckled his briefcase, laid out his papers, and spoke in his usual measured tone. It was the same way August had taught me to move snow. Push, guide. Coldwater Ridge Lodge, he said, was established on land purchased by August Clement Strand in 1974. Over the following 29 years, the property was developed through a partnership between August Strand and his son, Cormac James Strand. In 2003, August Strand passed the land and all structures to Cormac Strand through a notarized will that cleared probate without contest in 2004. He laid a sheet face-up on the table next to the transfer agreement, the probate stamp visible from several feet away. In 2006, Cormac Strand formally incorporated Strand Mountain Holdings, LLC, as the operating entity for the property. He has been the sole owner and managing member since the date of incorporation. I looked across at my son's face. He hadn't moved. His champagne glass sat on a surface behind him that he no longer cared about. His eyes shifted between Hollis and me, then back to Hollis. I could see him running the math. The numbers I had spent 40 years keeping hidden were lining up in his mind for the very first time, in an order he had never once considered. In 2016, Hollis continued, Cormac Strand hired Garrett William Pruitt to serve as general manager of Coldwater Ridge Lodge under a standard employment contract. Mr. Pruitt's role was operational oversight, managing day-to-day operations, staff supervision, and guest services. The contract explicitly excluded any ownership interest or authority to represent the property in commercial transactions. Hollis looked directly at Garrett. Mr. Pruitt owns no part of Coldwater Ridge Lodge. He has never owned any part of it. He is an employee of Strand Mountain Holdings, LLC. His employer is the man sitting right at this table. The words landed heavily. I watched them hit Derek. Not the kind of hit where you hear something and understand it instantly, but the kind where your mind rejects the information on the first pass and has to replay it internally to make it real. His mouth opened slightly. He stared at Garrett. You work for my dad, Derek said, his voice stripped of everything, certainty, performance, volume. Just those words, flat and stunned. You've been working for my dad the whole time. Garrett said nothing. The pen was still resting on the table in front of me. Somewhere near the middle of the room, a man stood up. I recognized him. The representative from Meridian Property Group in Denver. The man Garrett had invited to witness his planned transfer of authority. He had driven 4 hours from Denver for tonight, having signed a preliminary letter of intent with Garrett 6 weeks ago. He looked across the room at me, the look on his face, the room at me, the look on his face belonging man who had just realized every assumption he held was dead wrong. Excuse me, he said, his voice, carrying far in the quiet room. Are you saying Strand Mountain Holdings is headed by Cormac Strand? He is the sole owner, Hollis said. The man from Denver slowly sat back down. He reached for his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, looked at it for a second, and put it away. He looked at Garrett. Then he looked down at the table in front of him and didn't look up again. I tried to make an offer on Strand Mountain Holdings in 2021, he muttered, loud enough for the quiet room to hear. They turned it down cold. I was told the property wasn't for sale at any price. A short pause. I never could figure out who was running the show. He knew now. Marcus Webb's pen was moving again, fast and steady across his notebook, filling pages with the kind of notes that mean a story has completely turned on its head. Mayor Patricia Dunn sat, with both hands flat on her table, looking at me with an uncalculated expression of near wonder. For 12 years, anonymous donations had funded the winter employment program. 12 years of budget items listed simply as private donor. She was putting the pieces together right now, in real time, in front of 80 people. Derek turned toward his father-in-law, his voice so stripped of color it barely sounded like him. Garrett. He stopped, swallowing hard. Tell me you didn't know. Tell me. You didn't walk into my parents' house on Thanksgiving, sit across from my dad, ask him 3 questions about the resort, and know the whole time that He stopped again, bringing his hand up to press hard against his sternum, like a man checking if his chest was still intact. Tell me you didn't know. Garrett looked at Derek for a long moment. He didn't tell him he didn't know. The silence that followed was heavy with 4 years of dinners, conversations, and a promotion offered not out of trust, but out of strategy. And Derek stood right in the middle of it all. Hand pressed to his chest, the color completely drained from his face. A pale look that had nothing to do with champagne. Lacey's hand touched his arm. He didn't seem to feel it. I looked across the table at my son. The general manager was gone. The arrogance was gone. The man standing across from me had the lost, unstable look of someone who had just discovered the ground beneath his feet was built by someone else on a foundation he'd never bothered to check. For the first time all night, he looked like the boy I remembered. Hollis laid the final page on the table. He didn't make a big speech about it. He just placed it face up where the light caught it, saying softly to me, "Whenever you're ready, Cormac." I looked down at the page. Then I looked around the room. At Frank Odell at the back table, at Mayor Dunn sitting upright with wide eyes, at Marcus Webb writing furiously, at Owen standing with his hands finally resting at his sides, at Nora setting her phone down, at Paige watching me with her mother's eyes, and at Vera sitting straight beside Nadine Pruitt, hands folded on the table, looking at me just like she had for the last 39 years, steady, firm, completely unbothered by whatever came next. I stood up. I had been sitting at that table for 2 hours. I stood up the way I get up from every chair, slow, without drama. The way a man gets up when he's got 68 years in his knees and has learned that most things worth doing don't require a grand entrance. I adjusted my jacket. I put my hands in my pockets. I looked at Hollis and gave him a nod that meant, "Go ahead, finish it." Hollis turned to the last sheet in his folder. "There's one more matter," he said, "that I should bring to the attention of everyone present." He didn't look at Garrett when he said it. He looked at the 80 people in the room who had come for a celebration and stayed to witness something they'd be talking about for the rest of their lives. Mr. Garrett Pruitt, in his capacity as general manager of Coldwater Ridge Lodge, entered into preliminary negotiations with Meridian Property Group out of Denver, indicating an intent to facilitate the sale of this property. Hollis laid a 2-page stapled document on the table, the Meridian letterhead visible at the top. A letter of intent was signed 6 weeks ago. Mr. Pruitt represented himself in those negotiations as having authority to negotiate a sale. He had no such authority. He never did. The Meridian representative, sitting in the middle of the room, wiped a hand over his mouth and stared down at the tablecloth. Under Colorado law, Hollis continued, a general manager acting outside the scope of their employment contract to cause financial exposure to their employer constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. The letter of intent, combined with the transfer agreement, presented to Mr. Strand tonight, establishes a pattern of conduct that exposes Mr. Pruitt to substantial legal liability, including damages for tortious interference and breach of loyalty. He looked at Garrett for the first time since entering the room. I'll be filing the formal paperwork with the Colorado State Courts on Monday morning. Garrett's hand on the back of Derek's chair went completely still. Derek looked at his father-in-law with an expression I had never seen on my son's face. Not anger, not shock, but something far more fundamental. The look of a man who had just realized he wasn't the architect of anything. He was just the tool Garrett needed, the handle already pointed in the right direction. He had walked right in with his eyes open and his hands out, calling it his career. His chest heaved once, heavy. "You used me," Derek said, his voice barely a whisper, the quiet tone that comes right before something breaks completely. "You sat at my father's table. You shook his hand. You spent 4 years telling me you believed in me." His jaw clenched tight, muscles jumping in his cheek. "And you were using me the whole time." Garrett looked at his son-in-law for a second. Just a second. A look passed across his face that might have been the start of an explanation. Then it vanished, replaced by the controlled expression of a man who knew the room had turned against him and realized the only play left was silence. He said nothing. Lacey's hand slipped off Derek's arm. She took a step back, then another, until she stood alone at the edge of the table holding her champagne glass, the look of a woman quickly calculating which way the floor was tilting. I kept watching my son. Now I watched him raise a hand to touch his face, fingers pressing against his chin. A small, disoriented gesture of a man trying to find his bearings. Then Frank Odell stood up at the back of the room. Frank wasn't a man given to speeches. In 22 years, I'd heard him say more than 4 sentences in a row, maybe a dozen times. He stood up, the nearby tables, looking at him, and he looked across the room at me to say what he had come to say. "I've worked for this man for 22 years, Frank said, his voice rough and direct, the tone of a man who doesn't waste time polishing his words. I was here the morning he repaired the foundation on the east cabins by himself, because we were short-staffed. I was here the winter we lost the north heating system at 2 in the morning, and he was up on that roof in 15 below, cold, fixing it, while the guests slept. I watched him clear snow off this lot for 10,000 mornings." He paused. "In 22 years, I never once heard him tell anybody what he owned. Not once." He looked around the room. "I just think the folks in this room ought to know what kind of man they're talking about." He sat back down. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, a silence with a very different weight to it now. Then Hollis reached into his briefcase one last time. He pulled out something I recognized, an 8x10 black and white photograph mounted on cardstock. He set it on the table where the transfer agreement had been. It was a photo of August Strand, taken sometime in the late 70s, standing on snow that was clearly undeveloped back then. He was holding a shovel, sitting in the bed of my truck, the one I'd brought to the resort every morning for 21 straight years. "August Strand broke ground here in 1974 with that shovel," Hollis said. "Cormac Strand has used it every winter since his father passed. He used it this morning to clear the front walk of this building before driving over here." He looked around the room. I thought that was worth mentioning. Mayor Patricia Dunn brought a hand up to cover her mouth. Marcus Webb stopped writing and just stared at the photograph. I looked at it too. My father in the snow, young and determined, holding the tool that built everything. My throat tightened up in a way I hadn't expected, and I pressed my lips together, waiting for the feeling to pass. Then I looked at Derek. He was staring right at the photo. His eyes were wide and red-rimmed, and it had nothing to do with champagne. His hand was pressed flat against his chest again. I watched my son look at his grandfather, standing in the snow holding a shovel, and for the very first time, the full weight of what he had tried to sign away hit him all at once. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. "Dad," he finally choked out. Just that one word, with nothing left behind it. I looked at my son for a long moment. Here was a 40-year-old man, standing in the exact same emotional space as the 8-year-old boy I remembered, hand pressed to his chest, tears spilling over. The mask of the general manager had completely fallen away. I picked up the transfer agreement from the table. I held it up so the whole room could see it. Then, I folded it once, twice, and laid it back down. "This document," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet, "was prepared without my knowledge and presented under conditions that make it legally unenforceable. My attorney has already confirmed that. It will not be signed tonight, and it will not be signed any other night." I turned my gaze straight to Garrett. Your employment with Strand Mountain Holdings is terminated, effective immediately. Mr. Wayne has the official paperwork. Garrett picked up his leather folder from the table. He tucked it under his arm. He gave me one last look, the look of a man who played a long game and lost on the very last turn. Then, without a single word, he turned and walked toward the banquet hall doors. The room watched him go, in dead silence. Before the doors even swung fully shut behind Garrett, the sound started. It began as a low hum through the main speakers, that subtle audio cue when a system warms up and a recording feeds through the line. Back at the soundboard in the far corner, a 26-year-old named Eddie, who had worked at Coldwater Ridge for 3 years, and had a quiet talk with Frank Adele at 4:30 that afternoon, adjusted 2 levels and pressed play. Derek's voice filled the entire banquet hall. Not the voice Derek had right now. Not the stripped-down, red-eyed voice of a man who had just watched his certainty collapse. It was Derek's voice from 90 minutes ago, when he stood over this very table, finger jammed against the signature line, performing at full volume for the room. "Sign it, Dad. You've been a burden long enough. We're adults. We don't need a handyman following us around." A heavy pause on the track, and then, "Sign it. You've been nothing but a parasite your entire life. You always have been." The playback cut off. The quiet that followed was the absolute deepest silence I have ever experienced in a room full of people in my 68 years. It wasn't the quiet of shock. The room was well past being shocked. It was the heavy silence of 80 people, forced to sit face to face with words that could never be unsaid. Words broadcast a second time through the audio system of the very building owned by the speaker's father. Under Colorado's one-party consent law, can record it out informing the other parties. And I was a direct participant in every single conversation held in that room tonight. Frank had made sure the board was live before the first guest stepped through the doors. Everything was clean. Everything was documented. Eddie sat quietly behind the board with his hands resting in his lap. Derek hadn't moved an inch since the audio started playing. He stood at the edge of the table, exactly where he'd been when the recording cut out. His hand was still pressed flat against his chest, tears streaking his face. His mouth slightly open. That helpless look when the body doesn't know what expression to make for what the mind is processing. As the last echo of his own voice faded from the speakers, he closed his eyes. His shoulders slumped inward, and a low, broken sound came out of his chest. The sound of a man hearing his own true self from the outside for the very first time. Lacey took another step back. Owen sat down hard, laying his hands flat on the table and bowing his head, his jaw working as he tried desperately not to break down in front of 80 people. Nora lowered her phone. She looked at her brother for a long time, not with the triumph of someone who had won, but with the quiet sorrow of someone watching her worst fear play out and realizing it was just as bad as she'd imagined. She brought her free hand up to press against her lips. Paige let out a sound halfway between a breath and a sob. She covered her mouth with both hands and looked up at the ceiling, trying to hold it all in. Mayor Patricia Dunn sat with her hands flat on the table, her eyes shifting back and forth between Derek and me, piecing together a story that would stay with her for a long time. Marcus Webb was writing steadily again without looking up. The disciplined focus of a reporter who knew the story had told itself, and his only job now was to get every word down right. I stood up from my chair. I had been sitting for most of the night. I rose slowly, looking around the room, At Frank Odell at the back table, who gave me the same tight nod he'd given me that morning when I told him about the audio system. At Vera, sitting tall beside Nadine Pruitt, hands folded, watching me with 39 years of steady devotion. At Owen, still hunched over his hands. At Nora, hand over her mouth. At Paige, eyes wet, chin up. And finally, at Derek. My son looked back at me. The performance was gone. The loud posture was gone. All that borrowed confidence he'd worn for 4 years, like a coat that didn't fit, had completely vanished. All that was left was his real face. Older than I remembered. Worn out, but deep down, showing the first faint sign of the man he might finally become, given enough time and enough honesty. I had spoken more words tonight than I planned to. I only needed one more line. I walked around the table, passing Hollis, who stepped back to give me room, passing the folded transfer document, passing the photo of August standing in the snow. I stopped close enough to Derek that he could hear me without me ever having to raise my voice. I built this place so you'd have a foundation to stand on, I said quietly. Not so you could try to stand on top of me. I held his gaze for 3 long seconds. Then I turned and took Vera's hand as she rose to meet me. Together, we walked toward the banquet hall doors. Behind us, I heard the scrape of Owen's chair pushing back. Then Nora, then Paige, and then, from somewhere near the back of the room, a single pair of hands. Frank Odell began to clap. Slow and deliberate at first, the way Frank did everything. Then another pair joined in. Then another. By the time Vera and I reached the doors, the applause had built into a solid wall of sound that I didn't need to turn around to see. I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards under my boots, through the walls of the building my father started and I finished. It carried 68 years. Pre-dawns, mornings, freezing's air, worn ash handles, and that specific satisfaction that comes from work, that exvives from work, that asks for nothing more than that you show up and do it right. Son, I held the door for my wife, and we stepped out together into the Telluride night. Cold, clear, and perfectly still. The mountains were hidden in the dark, but they were there all the same, just like they always were. The way some things are always present whether you can see them or not. I took a deep breath. I slept. That was the first thing. Real, deep sleep. Something I hadn't had in months. I lay down beside Vera at 11:30 and was out before midnight, a clean, dreamless sleep like a body finally laying down a heavy pack. I woke up before 6. Old habits. I dressed in the dark, carried my boots downstairs, and reached by the back door for August's shovel. It was 8 degrees outside. An inch of fresh powder lay on the ground, smooth and untouched. The sky had that faint gray tone at the edges that meant the sun was coming, even if you couldn't see it yet. I started at the top of the front walk and worked my way down to the road. Push, lift, guide, don't fight the snow. 20 minutes in, I heard boots crunching in the snow behind me. Frank Odell was walking across the lot. Behind him, moving at an easy pace, were 6 of our longest-serving crew members. The men who had worked Coldwater Ridge through every season I'd run the place. Nobody said a word. They grabbed shovels from the equipment shed, spread out across the lot, and went to work. That was enough. That was more than enough. At 8 in the morning, Hollis served the formal termination letter to Garrett Pruitt. Breach of fiduciary duty and conflict of interest, effective immediately, with all company property to be returned within 48 hours. A second letter went to Garrett's attorney, outlining the civil suit, regarding the letter of intent with Meridian. I didn't read Garrett's response, if he sent one. Hollis handled it. That's what Hollis does. Derek called at 9:15, then at 9:40, and twice more before 11. I let every call go to voicemail. I wasn't ready yet. I kept shoveling. At 10:45, Vera called. "He sounds like himself again," she said. "The old version." I stood in the middle of the east path, with the shovel in my hands, feeling the cold wind on my face. "I'm not ready yet," I said. "I know," she replied. "I told him you were working." That evening, the five of us sat in the kitchen until past midnight. Vera, Owen, Nora, Paige, and me. I made a pot of chili using my mother's recipe, and we sat around the table eating, talking, sharing quiet moments, and eating some more. At one point, Paige started crying softly, and Nora put an arm around her while Owen refilled everyone's water without being asked. Nobody made a big deal out of it. We were well past needing to explain things. "Why didn't you tell us?" Owen asked, no longer angry, just curious. "Not about the money. Just why didn't you tell us who you were?" "I thought I was protecting you," I said. "Protecting you from how knowing a thing like that can change a person." And now, Nora looked up. "Now what?" I picked up my spoon. "Now I think August was smarter than I was. He told me what the land was worth the day he bought it. He didn't wait until I was 40. Owen let out something close to a laugh. "Yeah," he said softly. On Monday, Marcus Webb's story ran on the front page of the Telluride Daily Planet. A photo he'd taken at 6 in the morning. One I hadn't even noticed him taking. Showed my back in my work clothes. August's shovel carried over my shoulder, with the main lodge of Coldwater Ridge glowing golden in the early dark behind me and the San Juan Mountains rising in the distance. The headline read, "He built it. Every morning he comes back to work. Not because he has to, but because it's who he is." I read it over coffee at the kitchen table, folded it up, and slid it into the drawer where I keep things worth keeping. 3 months later, I hung August's shovel on the wall of the main office at the resort. The room I'd avoided calling mine for 21 years. The brass brackets were mounted right where the morning light hits first. No plaque, no long explanation. Frank saw it the day it went up and gave a single nod. That was all it needed. The civil case against Garrett was settled in March. I didn't go to court. Hollis handled everything. The Meridian deal had collapsed the very night of the banquet. I was told the Denver representative pulled the letter of intent within 48 hours, citing concerns over authority to negotiate. I didn't need to hear anything more about it. 5 months after the banquet, on a Thursday afternoon in April, my phone rang. It was Derek. I was sitting in my truck in the resort lot with the engine running, getting ready to drive home. I let it ring twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, I picked up. "Dad," he said. His voice was careful, quiet, stripped down to a sound I hadn't heard in 4 years. "I don't know where to start." "Start anywhere," I said. A long silence followed. Out past the windshield, the tree line on the mountains was beginning to show faint traces of green. That color meant winter was finally letting go. "Can I come up?" he asked. "Not to talk about the resort. None of that. I want to help with whatever work you're doing, if that's all right." I looked out at the mountains for a moment. "There's a fence line on the north boundary," I said. 2 posts need setting before the ground fully thaws. It's heavy work." "I know," he said. "You'll need gloves," I added. "Real work gloves, not the dress kind." A sound came through the line. Something between a breath and a word, a quiet release after holding on for far too long. "I know, Dad," he said softly. "I know." I hung August's shovel on that office wall for a reason. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The most costly mistake I made over 40 years wasn't a bad contract or a wrong hire. It was silence. I kept quiet, thinking I was protecting my children. But my silence opened a door for someone else to step through and nearly strip away everything my father and I built with our own two hands. If you're keeping something hidden from the people you love, Liz, clearly, because you think it protect them. Here, see this. Protect them. Sometimes it just leaves them standing in the dark without a compass, making choices they would never make if they could see the whole picture. Don't wait like I did. Speak the truth before someone else uses your silence against you. I'm not a man who talks much about faith, but I believe there are certain mornings laid out in a person's life. Mornings where you stand in the cold before dawn and understand with total clarity who you really are. That morning with August's shovel was one of them. What I know for certain is this. Real value isn't in what you accumulate. It's in the work you do when nobody's watching. Stories like this remind us that family rivalries aren't the real point. Truth spoken clearly in the right room can clear up years of heavy silence. Every story of standing up for what's right comes down to someone refusing to be pushed aside. These are lessons worth passing along. And real-life family conflicts can almost always be traced back to a moment where someone stopped being honest. Every one of those stories starts the exact same way, with a quiet gap where a real conversation should have been.